THA Talks, for free thought and open minds.
And for freedom of speech.
Hello, I'm Paul Obitelli and welcome to another edition of THA Talks, the alternative podcast show from the UK. Our talks include news, conspiracy, spirituality, the occult, science, history, art, philosophy, religion, and much more. If you'd like to check out our full archive, just go to www.thatalks.com to listen to or to download all our free content. And if there's anyone who'd like to contact us and give us some feedback, maybe you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can email us info@thatalks.com. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the show via our RSS feed, and you can also find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, and many other podcast directories out there. Hello, and thanks for joining me again here on THA Talks. It's good to be back. Been a very cold week this week, minus temperatures, a bit of snow, but that's prepares you for the summer. Enjoy the seasons, that's what I say. We've been still suffering from lockdownitis here in the UK. Hopefully Boris is going to release us from that soon, and we'll get some normality back. I think people are beginning to get a bit fed up now, and it's such a strange time. We've got the vaccines a lot. Obviously, a lot of people have got their opinions on the vaccines. I've certainly got my suspicions that there are certain agendas within it. I don't go too crazy with some of them out there, but I am suspicious of the general picture of how vaccines are becoming such a thing at the moment. And I just generally just do not trust the elite forces, whatever you want to call them, that are controlling the Western world at the moment, or the whole world. So it's just very difficult when you haven't got that trust, which I don't. But we're going to be covering a bit of that today. We're going to be covering vaccines. We're going to be covering the Trump impeachment, and we're going to be talking about Brexit. So we're going to be speaking with Chris from the ChickenWire YouTube channel. He came on the show back in July 2017, edition 165, if you want to check that out. And I'm going to be catching up with Chris with John White on the show as well. So without any further ado, how are you doing, Chris and John?
Hello. Yeah, really good.
Hello, THA, me again. Hi, Chris. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's really good to see you again. I think it was two years ago since we last did this.
It is. 2 years ago. We were all hysterically wrong about Theresa May's chances in a general election. I remember it was about that time, oh my God, that turned out different.
Yeah, and I mean, so much has happened. We've had, and we come from different, varied political orientations, and a lot's happened over the course of the last show. Since the last show we've done, we've had Brexit. That's still obviously going on. It's happened now. It's done. We've seen the outcome of the Trump 4 years. Obviously, there's an impeachment going on now, and also around all this, I suppose none of us were suspecting at all. When we were last talking, we've had COVID-19, which has completely changed the face of reality in the Western world and across the world. So we've got lots and lots to talk about. Obviously, there's three of us, so I'm going to kind of try my best to sit back a bit and let you guys have more of the stage, so to speak. Start off with, I mean, it's been a while, Chris. How are you doing? What you've been up to? And let's catch up with what you've been doing.
So you may or may not have noticed that my channel, ChickenWire, sort of stopped producing videos for a little while.
Right.
And that's mostly because of this whole COVID situation. So I'm on furlough at the moment, and I sort of felt like constantly making videos about COVID was sort of just reminding me of COVID all the time, and I felt personally like I just needed a break from the entire world of current affairs and politics and stuff. I still obviously keep up with it, but I don't make videos, and I probably will return to it once this whole pandemic and this whole situation's over. But if we can start with COVID, because I've been, as everyone else has probably been during this pandemic, really bored.
Yeah.
And so I came across the movie The Prince of Egypt. It's
right.
a DreamWorks movie about the Book of Exodus, and it hit me the other day. I had a very, very deep train of thought, which part of it I've written down, about how we view our leaders during pandemics.
Yeah,
go for it. Let's hear it.
Yeah, so the Book of Exodus has this idea of the Passover. So Ramesses was refusing to free the Hebrew people from enslavement, and so God sent 10 plagues over Egypt. The last plague was called the Passover, where any household which didn't have the blood of a lamb around their doorframe would lose their child. And so Ramesses' son died that night. And as a result, he was forced to free the Hebrew people. Now, what I found fascinating about this story is that here we are 2,000 years later. We understand things like sanitation and food production. We can identify a disease. We can name a disease. We can even vaccinate against COVID now. And yet we still value our leaders based on... We still judge the morality of our leaders based on how a disease spreads. So if more people die, we view that leader as less morally good than if less people die. And there might be some truth to that kind of judgment of the way in which we view things. I mean, the moral of the story is that if you worship a false god, if you commit sin, or as I think of it as an atheist, if you get distracted from what's important, you will lose out on what's most important to you. And you could apply the same narrative to every pandemic and natural disaster that humans have faced. So step one is that an external force of nature that humans don't fully understand, which is COVID. I mean, in the olden days, they blamed God, but now, even with gene identification, testing, and vaccination, the virus can still do things which go beyond our expectations, as we saw with the Kent variant, for example. Step two is as a sort of distracted and or careless set of people who don't expect a threat like COVID to happen. And step three is a sense that the disastrous actions, i.e., a sense that the distractions were less important than the natural power that affected the society. So some people think that Brexit and the way in which the Tories were trying to separate themselves from Europe was a distraction from the way in which the disease was spreading. And that led us into going into lockdown maybe a week late.
It's a lot to unpack there, Chris. I mean, to start with, your point about human beings, I mean, we don't evolve that quickly. We're not really that different than people 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. We're a lot better educated. So that is a major difference. We have access to a lot more information, but are fundamental psychological drives that different? I mean, that's a fascinating question all in its own. I mean, and in terms of how we view leadership, and I think I would say from what I see with the COVID situation is that it isn't the case that everybody sees leadership the same way. Not everyone's viewing leadership by the same metric. But in terms of the main narrative of society, this obsession with death and death numbers certainly drives how people are encouraged to view leadership.
Yeah, I sort of think that when these events kind of happen, people generally tend to turn on each other rather than turn against the virus. So, for example, during the Black Death, before the Black Death, many people saw priests as being sort of chosen by God. But when the priests either abandoned their parishes or they died from the plague, that meant that many of the priest positions had to be filled with local people who were sometimes corrupt. So the Catholic Church sort of lost its authority. And today we sort of view the NHS in the same way we did the church back then. In the 80s, and to this day...
That's a big one, isn't it? I mean, the NHS sacred cow and clap for the NHS, and there's almost a devotional kind of worship of the NHS. And yet, just yesterday, I was seeing some numbers that said that in the initial wave of COVID, 40% of infections happened inside hospitals.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's absolutely horrifying to think about it, isn't it? You go in for your gallstones or whatever, and you get infected with COVID. And of course, that fed a number of deaths. And then there was the decision, which I found absolutely horrifying, to ship infected elderly people out of hospitals into the nursing homes, and the consequence of that. So, I mean, and in terms of criticising leadership, I mean, there's a major one right there, isn't it? And we're also seeing the same thing in the United States right now with Governor Cuomo from New York, who made the same decision. And the same decision was made in a few other states as well. But by doing that, it created an early spike in infections and deaths. And even, my God, can you imagine, even CNN has been criticising Governor Cuomo in the last couple of days. Because it's a very different picture now, isn't it? Because, uniquely, unlike in Britain, America had the COVID outbreak in its election year, and that meant there was a certain fever to the hyperbole, about performance in office. Of course, here we are with Joe Biden, who was on the election trail, saying he had a plan and mask up for 100 days and so forth. And it's turned out he hasn't really shown much of a plan at all, other than doing the things that were already being done. So, there's a certain showmanship about leadership, I suppose, and can leaders really do things that differently? I mean, I think in terms of the vaccine, we've seen a big difference between the UK and the EU. So that's maybe an area to talk about. I mean, how do you feel about those thoughts?
I feel that it depends on your political persuasion in how you view your leadership at the time. I found that people have been very partisan, and sometimes that's not always been helpful. Our post-war political system is built for coping with people who do disagree with each other rather than a unified external threat. So when things like this happen, as we saw during the 80s with the AIDS pandemic, people will turn on a community of people like the gay community back then, or like old people versus young people today. And I found that, we do have systems in place like Parliament, which is there to encourage debate and disagreement, while we have other systems like NATO, which is there to sort of set this big set of morals so that war doesn't really happen, or is prevented as much as possible. So we're really good at dealing with things like war and terrorism and strikes and nationalism and protests and the economy and unemployment. But when there's an external threat that we don't quite understand, that's when party political sort of posturing gets in the way of what's really needed, which is unity.
I suppose, in a way, COVID's been a bit like an alien invasion, hasn't it? An external threat that nobody was really thinking about. Well, a few people were thinking about it. In terms of how I initially responded to COVID, I although I have this very conspiratorial kind of background, sort of questioning authority and questioning the prevailing narratives, and I could certainly see from the off how certain agendas could make use of a pandemic. And I think we've seen increasing evidence that people are making use of a pandemic, what we call the Great Reset, coming from the globalists of Davos and so forth. I initially thought, well, sometimes stuff just happens. It isn't always, a plot. Sometimes things can just happen. So, there's always going to be a chance that a nasty disease could arise.
Yeah.
So initially I took COVID very, very seriously. I think the longer that time has gone on, the less I feel the response has been justified, and the more concerned I am about the destruction of freedom of assembly, freedom of travel, and freedom of speech. Because, I feel that there's a very significant danger that the cure could end up a lot worse than the disease. And that once we lose these things, and especially once people become used to being reactionary with a kind of hysteria, the harder it is to get back to that equilibrium where society used to kind of work and different viewpoints used to kind of debate things, and we used to have a system that could cope and come up with a kind of sensible direction that we could unify around. I mean, how do you feel about those points?
I think like I said, it depends what side of politics you're on into how you view this pandemic. So generally, the left have been saying things like the government didn't go far enough in the first lockdown, or they didn't go early enough because they wanted to be different from Europe, they might say, or the government wasted taxpayers' money on large contracts for their mates, they would say, or the government isn't doing enough to support those out of work.
Or the farce of the Nightingale hospitals, which was a massive waste of resources. I would like to clear one thing up for you, Paul. What do we think of Boris Johnson?
You mean generally, or in this?
Well, particularly in views of COVID, how do we feel about him?
Well, when it first started, I liked. He seemed very apprehensive about doing the lockdown. It seemed like it was something that he was like the last thing he wanted to do. He was a libertarian, and the last thing he wanted to do was to start putting these sort of measures on society. And when he done that, the first lockdown, I kind of thought, well, maybe this virus, that it's what it needs, and that's what we've got to do. And I thought, but since then, it seems to me like that they couldn't have known exactly what they were doing, because since then it's just gone on and on and on, and it's got to the stage.
Let me put it this way: do you feel we have a socially conservative government?
Not really. No, I think
no, not at all.
I think what
could it be more authoritarian?
Conservative government do is they posture and they make people think if you vote for them, they're proud of your country. They've got sort of a very nationalistic flavour to them. They're very sort of anti-woke, and they're the ones that if you think along those lines, vote for us and we'll keep things steady. But in reality, they don't. It's like they'll say something, but they'll do very little. They said they were going to defund the BBC. The BBC's just put their prices up, and they've done nothing. So.
Wow.
I don't know. I mean,
the national broadcaster has its uses, unfortunately. It's a bit like the first part of the post-electoral system. Anybody rational agrees it'd be better if we reformed it to something with proportional representation. I mean, I've been making that argument for 30 odd years. And it's the same, but it's the same with the BBC. Oh, get rid of the BBC. Oh, hang on, it's got its uses.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's part of the problem, isn't it? Because a state pravda is when you're up against it can be very helpful.
Yeah, I think the thing is with this virus is there's too much. It's gone on for too long with uncertain statement. This might be. It could be this. The virus could be that. And I think at some stage, I hear too many stories. Someone went into hospital. There was complications.
Let me ask you it another way, Paul. If there was a general election tomorrow, would you vote for Boris Johnson?
Absolutely not. No, okay. I couldn't. It would be. I'd feel wrong.
And
I wouldn't be able to do it.
I wanted you to know that, Chris. Because, I mean, we certainly are pretty much disgusted, horrified with how this government's gone about things. And
it would be very difficult because I wouldn't know who to vote for. But I think I'd just, for the first time, I'd have to say, I just really don't,
Well, I mean, we'd probably vote for the Lawrence Fox party or maybe for the Farage party.
Yeah.
I mean, if either of them got their act together to look a little bit credible, at least.
I think people have got to stop voting because they're afraid of who's going to get in if they don't vote for someone else. That's got to go. We've got to just vote for who we want. Otherwise, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't agree with this. I mean, you two seem very far on the right. Not that you're far right, but you're on the right.
Yeah.
I don't agree with the way the right has been downplaying the virus either. I think both the left, in the way that they've tried to ask for more money, which we don't have, which has increased the deficit, made more economic pain than is necessary, and the right in the way that they've downplayed the virus and assumed that if people suddenly go out, eat out to help out, everything will get back to normal and people will be able to survive and things will be okay.
This is partly the point. Both have been the problem. Point here, Chris. You know, if we think back to Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto in late 2019, you know, free broadband for everybody and so forth and so on. I mean, whatever was in that manifesto, the cost of it couldn't even come close to the borrowing against the pandemic response. When, you know, I do believe that a very valid argument could be made that we would have been a lot better off sheltering the vulnerable people and letting everybody else get on with things.
See, I don't agree with that, because if you shelter the vulnerable, then you've still got people who are asymptomatic going to work and potentially going to care homes to visit their elderly relatives or to work in those care homes. The asymptomatic transmission has been seems to have been significantly debunked by recent studies. But I mean, this is we have such a lot of contrary information, don't we? I mean, this is all part of a confusion of the problem.
If I interject, I think where we're at the moment, it's because it's very easy to point at a virus or a disease and say this is horrific. It is. Any flu can be horrific for elderly people, and it is. That's why we have a lot of flu vaccines, because it can be a real problem some years. We've had, I think it was 2014, 15 or 15, 16 year. I think there are about 36,000 flu deaths or flu related deaths. So it is serious anyway. So it's very difficult to say, I don't take coronavirus seriously, because it does kill people. You know, it's any virus like that. If you home in on it, you say it's a very serious. So it is serious. But for me, I think it's only serious when you're above, sort of above, I suppose, above 70s, maybe 65. That's where it's really dangerous. Below that, it's no more of a danger than any other virus or disease. So I think from the very beginning, I sort of said, well, obviously what they're going to need to do, and it's unfortunate, but they're going to have to isolate the elderly and sort of segregate them and keep them away from this virus, because it's very dangerous for them. But instead, we've got kids not ruining their education. We've got the economy crashing. And I just think the whole direction of that, as John mentioned earlier, it's like the remedy is worse than the actual disease itself. It's been, from the word go, all the politicians, not just the Conservatives, none of them have made any sense in my book. That's how I feel.
We started this segment with Chris mentioning, you know, the parable of Passover, and he also made reference to the Black Death. And of course, when the Black Death happened in medieval Europe, it was seen as the work of the devil, and cats were seen as the devil's familiars. So it was a bad time to be a cat in medieval Europe, because, you know, they got slaughtered. It was an apocalypse of the cats. But by doing that, by getting rid of the cats, society's best defence against the real cause of the disease were rats and the fleas on the rats. You know, I mean, so it's so often the way that what we end up doing is self-defeating, because we're being reactionary, we're being driven by our fear, especially, which makes people emotional and irrational, and they do things that we wouldn't otherwise do under any other circumstances, and we end up, making things worse for ourselves. And I don't think necessarily the slavish clinging on to the idea of lockdowns as the answer, it may prove to be not that different to the notion of the medieval cats. Right. I mean, especially since when we're dealing with the vaccine, those of us who are willing to go ahead with having the damn thing, it needs to be pointed out, this vaccine does not create immunity. It's not a vaccine like a polio vaccine or a smallpox vaccine. What the coronavirus vaccines do is they modify the body's response to the virus so that you don't get a severe case.
Yeah,
it's supposed to ameliorate the case, but people being vaccinated doesn't stop anybody else catching it.
Yeah. Well,
So it's quite unlike
there's
any other
been
vaccine.
evidence
let's let
showing
Chris.
the opposite.
Sorry, Chris. Let Chris have the look because we've got to move on to. We've got other subjects to cover. So let Chris have the last sort of have his views on this point and the virus and that, and then we'll move on to another subject. So, floor's yours, Chris.
I think there has been loose evidence more recently showing that the vaccine does stop transmission a little bit. And secondly, I'd agree on the point that the way in which we conduct politics during these times isn't conducive to a good result, because politics is designed to sort of stick to a manifesto. And take Prime Minister's questions as an example. It's designed so that somebody can stand up and say, I'm right, you're wrong. But in scientific terms, during this pandemic, we don't really know what's right and wrong because we're kind of drawing the conclusions as we go. I'd agree on that point. I disagree on the point that turning on each other is a good thing and blaming just the vulnerable community and telling them that they should only self-isolate, because I think that isolates, as we saw during the AIDS pandemic, it isolates the virus to blame to a particular community, which then makes the problem a lot worse because it stigmatizes people. It creates a social divide that isn't necessary. And really, the virus is a threat to us all, and we should all take it seriously.
I mean, I agree, Chris. I mean, I think you're right. You're quite right to see that there are risks, and if the response was originally only to isolate the vulnerable, then a social reaction might have been to stigmatize the vulnerable. I mean, I can see exactly how that could be true. But then, with the situation that we've got, which is kind of ended up worse for everybody, and at what point do we feel safe to return to being normal? And I mean that's a very big question. How do we get out of this? I know we're into it.
I know Boris is going to be speaking soon on that, so hopefully we'll have some clarity over the next. I know they've vaccinated a lot of people, so fingers crossed we are going to turn a corner. But we'll have to leave that one there because we've got other stuff we've got so much stuff to talk about at the moment. It's just, I mean, maybe we'll have to do another show and indulge deeper in these points. But what about Brexit?
President Trump, he's such a naughty boy, isn't he? I mean, what's he been up to?
Well, should we do Brexit or impeachment first? Which one do we want to do?
What do you want to do first, Chris?
We'll do impeachment.
Okay,
it's more current.
Well, give us your view of it all.
I think Donald Trump became. I'm not gonna lie, I supported him to begin with, but this last 2020 year, I felt that he's ventured further to the right in a way that's much more alien than what we'd get here in the UK. First of all, Donald Trump, we wouldn't have a figure like Donald Trump in the UK at all. For a start, because, I mean, people have compared Boris to Trump a lot, and really Boris is his policies in terms of supporting the environment, supporting mask wearing, supporting, being not in denial of the virus during this pandemic, show that Boris Johnson is a world away from the politics of Donald Trump. In terms of the personality, the way in which Donald Trump is anti-media, anti-establishment, we sort of had that in terms of Jeremy Corbyn, but even Jeremy Corbyn failed to win an election because he couldn't unite his party, because we have a parliamentary system rather than a presidential system on Brexit. So he couldn't unite his backbenchers with the party members on whether to have a second referendum or to stay in the customs union. Secondly, Donald Trump is a lot more far right than any UK politician, even Nigel Farage, in terms of his immigration stance and in the way even Nigel Farage doesn't promote the idea that the US election was fraudulent. That was completely Donald Trump's hypothesis, and there were 62 court cases. He lost 61 of them and proved that there was no evidence for a fraudulent election. So Donald Trump went down this really weird, loony path. And I think he's always been the great orator and great at getting people to go out to do something. I don't think that he told people to riot in the Capitol explicitly, but he did create a narrative that was dangerous to the whole of US politics, which is completely alien to me, because it's not. I couldn't imagine a group of protesters doing that here in Parliament with our policing system and everything that goes on here. Even if, I mean, the most far-right person that I've seen come to prominence is Stephen Yaxley Lennon or Tommy Robinson. And even he failed. He's losing his kind of social media presence as a result. And he sort of disappeared into the nether regions. But Donald Trump, he's still a very significant figure here in the US. And he's likely to be acquitted, which is extraordinary considering what happened during those Capitol riots. You had people dying.
Let me interject first,
police officers. Yeah.
John, just to come in so we can get. I just have to say, because basically, I get this a lot from. I'm listening to what you're saying, and generally across the board in politics at the moment, when people refer to far right, for me, it sounds like they're just referring to nationalism. And nationalism isn't right or left. I mean, Stalin was a nationalist, particularly towards the end, and he was as far left politically as you can get. So when we talk about Trump, I'd admit he's a nationalist, or he's a civic nationalist. He believes in if you've got an American passport, you're first, Americans first, So on that regard, but I'd say politically, he comes across pretty centrist. His policies. He did reduce taxes, but that was across the board, and so I think that's an important thing. And to touch on that, when you spoke about Corbyn, now I agree the media gave Corbyn a hard time to an extent, but the reason is because he's kind of a funny position, Corbyn, because on one side he's a globalist, he's open borders, he plays ball with the globalists, but on the other hand, he's also got a lot of economical nationalist policies where he wants to nationalise a lot of things, and that's where they don't like him. That's where the BBC don't like him. If he didn't do that, he would be their golden child. But because economically he's quite nationalist, which in some people's eyes could see that's far right in itself, a nationalist policy like that, but it isn't, because nationalism is just itself. It's not an orientation. It's not right or left. It's just how much you believe in the nation state. You could have a completely left-wing nation state and closed borders and high tax rates and big welfare and so on. So I think that's important. And it's like with Tommy Robinson. Just to the irony of that is Tommy Robinson. He did build up from get populists from a lot of far right support. I'll admit that, a lot of far right support. But ironically, the reason he's losing popularity now is because a lot of the far right no longer see him as far right. They think he's a stooge. He's playing tricks with them. He's using them. So they've dropped him. And as a result, you're right, his popularity has gone because, ironically, the far right have kind of left him at the moment. But let's have some points from John, and then we can go back to Chris again.
I think it's all fascinating. I mean, in terms of Tommy Robinson, I think perhaps we're in danger of going down a red herring there in talking about it too much. But I would say that the one thing I would say about Tommy Robinson is you're right, Paul. He did have a lot of actually far right, which I associate with race supremacy. You see, if someone's far right, they're race supremacist. He did have that support until they realised that Tommy is not against people of colour. He was against Islamic extremism, which is a particular subset of an ideology, which you could be an Islamic extremist and you can be as white as snow, So it's not necessarily about race in terms of the risk of Islamic extremism in Western countries. I mean, of course, in the UK in particular. So, the fact that Tommy has got a lot of Muslim and Pakistani friends, is partly of what has damaged his influence, as well as, of course, having his social media legs cut off. So, I mean, I I mean, you know that I've supported him on a free speech issue, but I'm never entirely a Tommy Robinson person. But in terms of Trump, I think it's fascinating, because whereas one point of view of Trump is he's far right because he's into controlled borders. Or America first, America for Americans, American advantage, and these ideas have been associated with far right. They really don't have. I mean, I don't see them as intensely racist supremacist any more than in fact, probably a lot less than the ideas which are banded around in Black Lives Matter are race supremacist. So I think that Trump's this bogeyman, but I mean, what he really represented was this powerful outside force, outside of the establishment. And I think if we reflected on how things looked for Donald Trump's chances of re-election in December 2019, 11 months before the election, I mean, everybody thought that he was down to win, including the Democrats. But the COVID situation and the unrelenting hysteria about COVID, which has dominated American media. I don't know. Have you seen any, Chris? Have you sort of seen how America has covered the COVID story?
I've mostly seen it from UK media perspective, so not really.
I watched the second town hall debate with Donald Trump. I think it was NBC. But because I was catching it live streaming across the internet, it was basically somebody dumping NBC onto YouTube, you see. So I got all of the in-between takes and stuff, and absolutely horrible. I mean, you'd think you were watching an advert for a horror film, the way that it revved it up, deaths, fear. I mean, really, totally unlike what we get in the UK. And if you think about that, that's been what the American people have had pushed out, not just through the left-wing channels, right-wing channels too. I mean, the Fox News certainly isn't any better. They've had a really sort of hyperbolic narrative. And, if you say, it's 100,000 Americans dead, 200,000 Americans dead, 300,000 Americans dead, but then you put that against a country of 360 million people and how many die every year of pneumonia or influenza on a good year anyway, that sense of proportion has been very lacking. And I think that I would say that having watched Trump quite closely, I would say that completely derailed what he wanted to talk about, which would be how good the economy was doing, how much more money is in your wage packet, how much less taxes you're paying, how much stronger America is because it's energy independent, and the other things which are really the key elements of his successful policies. I think that to see that Trump was under incredible pressure in his last year in office, I think that's only fair. I mean, you mentioned that you supported him initially. What was your reasons for supporting him?
Well, I'm not American, so there's that. There's that. But also, I just saw him as a anti-establishment figure that could generally change the world more enthusiastically than, I mean, I liked Obama as well, but who could do stuff like not going to war in Afghanistan and Iran, which he did, which I thought was incredibly good for the world. Supporting Brexit, obviously, that's a good thing for us as a country.
Well, of course, we missed a trick there, couldn't we? Because, I mean, the door was wide open to get a trade deal with the US, but Theresa May wouldn't do it.
Yeah. Well, that was Theresa May.
It certainly was.
Can I just read out? It's just come in the news that Trump has been cleared of inciting a mob attack on the US Capitol.
Not at all surprised. I'm not at all surprised. I think it was inevitable. In case anyone doesn't know, to get a vote to convict in an impeachment trial, you need 2/3 of the 100 senators. So the chances of getting 67 were not good in the first place. This has been a very strange.
The thing is, it's
a very strange episode in American history.
It's one of those things because it's a very dangerous area, because ultimately, what Trump said, he said, do not, go there and make your voices heard. Let's fight and fight. But that's, just because you're saying fight, it doesn't mean you're in fight. And he said with peacefully and patriotically. Now, their argument is basically it was a crypto message to say, get down there and raise hell. Now, the only one who knows that for a fact is him. That's the only one. If we start, it's that same thing. If we start thinking that we can start implying we know what you really meant, that's attacking free speech. Now, there was nothing, and I will add as well, since then, there's been arrests made that not all the people that were being violent were even Trump supporters. There's been some Black Lives Matter people arrested, some Antifa and people involved. So it was obviously an excuse for a lot of people to go down and do this. And lastly, what I'll add before I let someone else in is I think you mentioned earlier that we'd never see that in the House of Parliament here or anything. And I 100% agree with you. But there are videos that show the police inviting these people in. And a lot of these people were almost like families taking pictures, oh, sweetie, look at that. That looks great. Not causing any, and just inviting them in. Now, what do they think is going to happen if you invite these people in? They know that some of them were being violent. The ones they invited in weren't at that time, but it just seems like they were like, come on in. They wanted it to happen just to create a real bad thing. That's how it seems to me. I mean, to be honest, I haven't seen the ins and outs of the violence that took place. I know there was about 4 Trump people that died, and I think 1 policeman, something like that. But
it's still a very murky picture as to exactly what happened with these deaths. The one death we could be absolutely certain about was Ashley Babbitt, who was shot dead trying to climb through that window inside the Capitol.
And there was a gunman behind her that was actually more concerned about the guy with the gun than her. He was pointing them
with a rifle, who was pointing his rifle at the threat until he realised she'd been shot dead by the Secret Service. Yes,
but he was pointing his gun towards the guy that shot. He's thinking, "What the hell was that?" Because he obviously saw that as more of a threat than she was.
I mean, it was a crazy situation in there. Yeah. But I mean, I do think that the framing of that as an insurrection, bit of a damn joke. It was a protest that got out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, to have an insurrection, you've got to have a serious plan to take over, and that's just it's a joke, and I would certainly say that in terms of the American patriots that I'm aware of, none of them thought that January 6th was about an insurrection. I believe they felt that it was about a show of strength to say to Congress, we're not happy, we're not taking it, we're not happy with the failure of our systems. I mean, you mentioned the 61 court cases, Chris, and on the face of it, yes, that is correct. But if you dig into that a little more, those overwhelmingly are cases where the evidence was unable to be heard. So they were rulings on standing, which said, no, you haven't got the right to bring that case. So we're not, even up to the Supreme Court level. So, I mean, in terms of the Trump supporting movement and how they view the response to the allegations of election fraud, I mean, I think it's fair to say the American system hasn't done what it should have done to credibly disprove that. And the Senate had a hearing which had all sorts of alarming information in it, but there's been no consequences of it. And the impression which has been given is that the establishment closed ranks because they would rather have united around Biden than challenged that. And the risk to a system when there's serious corruption is that exposing the corruption will mean that people lose faith and the system will collapse. So that's always got to be part of the concern behind this. But I found it really interesting listening to the House manager's prosecution case against Donald Trump. And when I listened to it carefully, they had to emphasize again and again and again there was no basis to believe that there was election fraud. Because if there was basis to believe that there was election fraud, then under the American Constitution itself, what those people were doing by protesting and refusing to accept the election could very well be defined as their patriotic duty. So I have a question for you, Chris. If you felt that an election had been overwhelmingly, clearly stolen in the United Kingdom, and that a party which clearly shouldn't have won had got away with it and had fixed the results and stolen the results, what do you feel that you could or should do?
Well, it's either one of two things, really, isn't it? It's either that the American system is broken, that it's been secretly run by the establishment, it's been run by Hollywood, if you go to a court with a political case, the court will dismiss that because it's a political case, and therefore you can't raise political disputes. It's either that the senators are so afraid of losing votes that's why that they acquitted Donald Trump, and that there's this genuine right-wing feeling of oppression from the white working class people. Or, as I view it, it's that Donald Trump has used the isolated nature of Americans and social media to exploit people to distrusting that establishment that they need to carry out these democratically fair elections. There isn't that much evidence of election fraud that I know of that is legitimate. The only things I've heard are things that have been sort of exaggerated through right-wing voices without evidence in court or any kind of substantial evidence in that the mainstream media could broadcast.
Well, I mean, I would point out that we have done podcasts on this very topic not long ago, and I would say, in fairness, I don't know that. I do think that there is evidence that there is corruption in the American election system. And I also know as a fact that it was the Democrats who spent late 2016 and most of 2017 shouting about it. But when it's their turn, all of a sudden they don't care about signature verification, for example, which is a safety measure to prevent large amounts of dodgy ballots being dumped into the system. And in California, we've got Governor Newsom suddenly at risk of losing the governorship because of a recall petition, and suddenly when it's his election, he's now screaming blue murder about signature verification. So these things tell a story, don't they? And I just feel that overall, I think that no matter what Donald Trump did or did not say, I believe that there's many millions of Americans who are very unhappy with how the election was conducted. However strong or weak parts or individual parts of all the evidence are, however grounded in reality or not their concerns are, and that a responsible system, one that was really interested in unity, would put the credibility of the election process and fortifying the election system so that fraud was absolutely impossible, and that everybody knew that, would be a major important step going forward. But in terms of inciting, I think the most inciting thing Donald Trump did was refuse to concede. And I think that if Trump had conceded, on the day of the result or soon after the result, I think that the energy of people would have dissipated to a certain extent. But I also think that when there is good reason to believe that at least the election was dodgy, again, I don't know that Joe Biden lost it. I mean, I couldn't say that with certainty, but there were rights. There's a right of the president to contest an election that he saw was crooked. And I think that for Trump supporters, I think a major point was just before Christmas, where the US Supreme Court refused to hear the case that had been brought by Texas and backed by, it was almost 30 other states, about the eligibility of mail-in ballots and the chain of custody and so forth and so on. Because I believe that the Supreme Court looked at it and thought, well, if we hear this case, we don't know the true result of the election either. And if it turns out that Joe Biden remains the winner, then the Democrats will completely eviscerate the Supreme Court by dumping in all these extra judges they were talking about. So, there is a political calculation at the very heart of what cases or not were even heard. And I mean, for Supreme Court to say that case had no standing, I think that was a watershed moment in people realizing that this was actually getting unlikely to be turned around. I mean, I'm not talking about the people who were really completely believing, that the military was going to step in or something like that to put things right. But I think in a general Trump voter base, I think that Supreme Court decision not to hear that case before Christmas, I think things could have gone very differently if they had done. At least to the point where they wouldn't have been able to certify on January 6th.
Yeah, this is the thing that gets me, is like, obviously there was a certain amount of fraud. It's there, you can see it. The question is the question is how much of it was there. And the thing is, Trump, he was being very passionate and OTT. He was going for it. We will win, no doubt about that. But he was doing it at a time there he was contesting the result. He said, I don't concede, I'm contesting, I think there was fraud. That should have been investigated, because it's not as if he'd done it after he lost it. He'd done it in the middle of the night. He said, right, I'm putting my hand up, cheating. There's, very, very serious accusations that should have been dealt in court. There was a couple local cases, and that was very sort of, I think one of them was appointed by by Obama and stuff. Was never going to rub it. It needed to go to the Supreme Court and that didn't happen. Now, it might have happened, and they might have said, well, okay, you got a point, this, but I'm sorry, the vote's still, you still lost. Or it could have gone the other way, and it would have been massive. It would have been a biggest shock for the world. But democracy would have needed that decision to be made and sorted. Now, afterwards, if you notice, they're very quiet and very, they're not saying, because that phase has gone now. So now it would have to be done legally and very carefully. But we have got to move past this point now anyway. But Chris hasn't.
Very quickly, I've got just one more thing about this.
And then let's go to Chris.
The result of today is that potentially Donald Trump could run for president again.
Yeah.
But I would say that the future is quite some distance away, and the idea that he automatically would have the backing to run again in 2024, I think that's actually totally premature. And I believe that as time goes on, I think the failures of the Trump presidency are going to become more and more apparent. And I think that people are going to be writing books and so forth and so on. And I think there's a danger for Trump that he's going to be seen as somebody who's actually too soft and too weak, and who was made a fool of by too many of his officials, especially people like Bill Barr.
Right.
Anything else you want to add on before we move on, Chris? Because
it'd be fascinating to see what happens to Donald Trump now, because obviously he's got this criminal court case in Georgia, so he could be criminalized. He's banned from Twitter, so he's going to have to broadcast his views on a television or a website somewhere. And the Republicans are going to have to decide whether they move on from Trump, realizing that his support is dwindling, or whether they kind of stick with Trump and carry on this kind of message that they voted to acquit Trump, and therefore they support the views of those people, of those white working class Americans who are skeptical. And
it also depends on how much America declines under the next 4 years under Biden. And I do believe that America is going to decline.
Yeah, I think Joe Biden's legacy won't be Joe Biden's politics. I think it will be dealing with whatever Donald Trump left behind.
Within 2 years, I predict another war, whether it be in Syria, something. They'll kick it off again. They're from the same. It's whether but we'll see on that one. Let's we're obviously this is a lot. I knew it was going to be a long. There's three of us, and trying to make sure you get your
hit us, Chris.
Yeah, Brexit. Trying to make sure Chris gets his say, because there's obviously me and John sort of going at him here. So obviously Brexit. This is, I mean, it's been done and dusted now. We had 4 years of absolute chaos, to be honest, a real battle. I'd actually think Farage did get it right when he said the war is over, because although people didn't like that terminology, I think there was a political war going on in this country for many years and it exhausted a lot of people. It's done now. Brexit's happened. There is a lot of fuss going on now. I can actually, because I know people that work in the freight industry, and there's some guy said to me the other day, he said at the moment it's easier to ship machinery like cars and big sort of units across the ocean to Australia than it is to ship a pallet from Italy to here, because there's just so much faffing around going on. So I think there's a lot of games being played, a lot of, I think the EU are very sort of parts of the EU, probably not the countries, but the organisation have been a bit bitter, in my opinion. That's what it looks like. And obviously it's not settled yet, but it's done. And now we've got to just sort of see where we're going. So over to you, Chris. You can start on this and what your views are on Brexit from where we are now.
Well, my view is that in terms of the big picture, I think leaving the EU has been vindicated definitely in the last few weeks in terms of obviously the vaccine rollout, and also the fact that there isn't, I mean, it was in the news yesterday that there wasn't big queues at the borders with hauliers. And, we've managed to get trade deals across the world. We've essentially succeeded in leaving the EU. But the problems are in businesses being able to import stuff, in people being able to buy stuff online without having to pay tax. And from what I gather, and what I've always suspected about Brexit, is that the problems of Brexit always affect people of a middle class rather than a working class perspective. And I know that there will be working class people affected by Brexit, but my view is that businesses and people ordering stuff online having problems is something that isn't in. They're not Labour voters, traditional Labour voters. Let's put it that way, and therefore, Keir Starmer is going to struggle to win back the votes of the working classes who voted to leave the EU if he starts going down this line of, we've got so many problems here, there and everywhere, when actually the working class people of the UK will have found that the immigration laws that we introduce and our trade deals and our, before COVID, this big kind of surge in trying to upgrade our infrastructure, and the way in which we've got this vaccine rolled out, and the way in which we've procured it, which might mean hopefully we get our economy open sooner. People who have working class jobs in the UK will feel sort of vindicated by their vote to leave, and I also think that. That I think I've lost my train of thought. So
I do that all the time. Okay, over to you, John.
Well, yes, we have done it. I mean, Brexit has happened. We are in a post-Brexit world, and I'm quite encouraged by what I've heard Chris say there. Because he's not saying it's a terrible idea, it's all been a disaster, etc. I mean, he's recognising. But there are now benefits, and that there's we need a positive step forward from the situation that we are now in, and I think that's great, and I think that's very encouraging, because I think certainly in terms of social media, anybody's going to use a hashtag FBPE, they're as bad as they've ever been, because they're not ready to move on. And I think that Chris is quite right to say that there's a certain middle class obsession with the idea, with the notion of Europeanism, which is also, always kind of a little bit tendency to be seduced by authoritarian liberalism, which I think is very much what the EU politically has represented. It's got liberal ideas, but it's been prepared to be very authoritarian about it, imposing prime ministers on Italy and beggaring people with austerity plans and so forth. I think with where we are, there are definitely problems, but there was always going to be problems. Problems are issues that look towards solutions. Right now, there are problems with British food producers having trouble exporting to the European Union. There are problems with the fishing industry. There's the problem with the Irish border and the agreement to have a sort of border down the middle of the sea, and how that's really not working out. There's political pressure to abandon that agreement with the EU. And of course, there is the vexed Scottish question, which we're going to see how that goes in Scotland in 3 months' time, assuming that those elections do go ahead as planned. So, there's definitely real issues. And I also think that Chris is right in that, if the political left or the political centre can speak to people's concerns about the future in a better way, they could end up profiting more from Brexit than the kind of conservative vision of it. But I also think that at the time that we got the Brexit referendum, we had a conservative liberal coalition. It wasn't a unified Conservative government. And in a certain extent, I reject the narrative that Brexit's always been a right-wing project, partly because I know have always had problems with the question of the EU, Jeremy Corbyn certainly being one of them. But it was in terms of the situation in 2014, with Cameron facing a general election the next year, and the idea of being vulnerable on his flank to the pro-referendum sort of lot going off to vote for Nigel Farage instead after acing it with the European elections with UKIP, the UKIP threat, I think it created a particular and quite unusual and remarkable set of political pressures that bent his arm, so that he basically bribed the electorate with a referendum offer in order to keep their votes in the general election. But I don't think he did so at the time, thinking that he was going to lose that referendum. But then I don't think that Cameron, as an upper class Conservative, was particularly in touch with the feelings in the lower sections of society, especially as it was poorer communities that felt the impact of immigration more and more in terms of can't see a doctor anymore, schools are filling up, these sort of questions.
Yeah, I think the proof still really is in the pudding with Brexit, because I still think we've got to get over this current pandemic and then sort of rebuild an economy first to sort of really see what's going to happen in terms of us being separated from the EU. But on the Scotland question, I think that Nicola Sturgeon's very, very willing to exploit the Brexit question in Scotland, the fact that Scotland voted Remain and the rest of the UK voted to leave, except Northern Ireland. But it's going to be very difficult for her during the May election, because we may well have vaccinated the majority of the country by then as a result of not being in the EU's procurement for vaccines. So to make that argument that we left the EU and therefore we should go back into the EU because we're Scotland and they're England and we want to be independent, it falls flat when you're in that situation. And I'm at least hoping that I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, in terms of a rational argument for Scottish independence, but I think it's also
we could say, in terms of a rational argument for Brexit, because it wasn't all about being the rationality of it. It wasn't all about, am I going to have 95 pence or 105 pence? Which way is better off for me? I mean, that isn't the whole of it when it comes to the crucial idea of sovereignty. I mean, I believe that if Scotland wants to become independent, Scotland should become independent. I've never stood in the way of Scottish independence, as much as I feel I'd like to see it happen. I certainly don't support it, but I'm not in the way of it, and I believe in democracy. But whether an independence referendum could really be run, and I think that, COVID's going to make a difference to that, not only in terms of vaccinating the Scottish population way ahead of anybody else in any other European country, or potentially be a European country. There's also the question of a financial support. And then there's the SNP record in government, which is frankly shockingly bad. So, I don't think the idea that Scottish independence was automatically going to happen, I don't think that really stands up. And I also feel that, to see the opportunities for Britain in Brexit today, I think we also need to see the opportunities that we gave up to enter the European Union 50 years ago. Especially in terms of the absolute demolition of the trade with the Commonwealth, which we had to give up to join the EU. So I think that we're seeing these green shoots. Well, they're more than green shoots. I mean, they're rocketing shoots. Britain re-engaging with world trade in a way that we simply have not been allowed to do. And I think that whether you've got a trade deal or not isn't the be all and end all, because there's always world trade rules to agree upon. But the openness to markets is the most vitally important thing. And I think that we have historically had a legacy of being an ocean-going trading nation. And I don't think that's any different today than it was when it was 200 years ago or 500 years ago. And I think that I've always believed that Britain gave up too much to be governed from the continent, which reflected what the EU was. I mean, our parliament was largely and increasingly administrators, not owners, not running the show, And I also think that we have a political class that is so unused to the responsibility of actually being in charge. But I think we're going to see a continuing process of reform and change inside of the UK. And I do hope that it extends to having first past the post changed into proportional representation at some point in the not too distant future. So a few thoughts there. I mean, I've got a few out, but what do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I'm not really a fan of proportional representation because it kind of constantly leaves hung parliaments or fringe parties that have more influence than they should really have influence, I think.
Always that argument against it, yes.
Yeah. I think in terms of, we'll go back to Scotland first, I think that whether or not to have a referendum in Scotland next year, if the SNP win their local elections, could be our Trump fraudulent election moment. I think.
Well, I mean, it's a question of if they win the election, does Boris allow it, or does Nicola Sturgeon declare one unilaterally, and then we're in a Spain Catalonia situation then.
Yeah, and I think that I think it's still too early to see what the impact of our trade deals around the world will be. I think it's likely that there will be some kind of political issue in the way in which the West relates to the East, for example. As we've seen during this pandemic, we've seen the Eastern countries, China, being able to shut up people and control dissent and, pretty much lie about how many coronavirus deaths that they have. And there's the argument that because they've done all that, that democracy is not good for the world. You're better off having that kind of dictatorship where you can control things when you've got an external threat like a virus. And there's going to be a lot of tension in how we trade with nations like that, when that we'll need to trade with them, because we'll need the trade with not being in the EU. But I think it could potentially prove to be a very sticky situation in the coming years in how the West deals with China, depending on.
That's very true. I mean, I think it's also, it's a misnomer to think that Brexit means we don't trade with Europe, because there are such things as geographic markets. And I mean, I think one of the key things I've made as an argument for Brexit was that EU membership itself had done next to nothing to improve our where we traded with and the volumes of trade that we did in terms of Europe, because we were always going to make more sense for us to be trading, France, Holland, Germany, Denmark, and we were trading less with Spain, Portugal, Greece, Italy, simply because of the geography of it, and that being in the EU, not being in the EU, it didn't make that big a difference to the fact that we've got stuff we want to sell to people nearby to us. People nearby to us has got stuff they want to sell to us. So I even with the worst projections of Brexit in terms of EU trade, it was always a hit that would recover in a decade or so. So once these rules issues are sorted out, and the current areas of negotiation, get smoothed out over the next year or two, I think it's going to be 5 years plus before we can really evaluate if Brexit has made us better off or not. Certainly in terms of Europe. But in the meanwhile, everything we do with improving our trade with the rest of the world is all gravy on the pie, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it might come back to haunt us depending on what the world situation could be. I think in terms of Europe, I'd like to see the European Union reformed in a way that it becomes less political and much more just a trade body. And I'm hoping that there is at least some change from this virus, from the vaccine rollout, which kind of wakes up the European nations a little bit. And I think if we ever got into that kind of situation where it was just a trade body rather than a political entity, I think the UK could quite happily just rejoin it, provided that we can opt out the single market and the customs union.
I tend to agree with you. Yeah, I mean, I've never had an issue with the idea of the EEC per se. Only that's not entirely true, because of course it restricted our trade to the rest of the world just to begin it, and it is a protectionist cartel, But in terms of a trade club, never had a problem with that. And if the EU could reform, but well, I'm not so sure about that. The European Commission would agree. They're rather invested in their project. So that's their rod for their backs. And, at least now we have returned to a point where the decisions for Britain are made in Britain, and that politics has a real chance to make a difference to our lives in a way that it wouldn't have done if we hadn't left. Even though there's risks attached to that too, in terms of potential risk of a government coming in and trashing human rights legislation, I don't really believe the public would ever really let that happen. But
no, I don't.
But then with what we've seen with how rights have been abrogated in response to the pandemic, maybe that's optimistic.
I think, I saw that kind of conversation on Twitter, and I thought that's a complete overreaction to what would happen in this country. Because I think, should the Tory government mess with the Working Time Directive or human rights in any way, I think that gives Labour the ground to make that point in the next election for them to lose. I don't see them doing it.
Important to recognise Conservative voters are not lemons, and they like their rights as much as anybody else, So I always felt that those kind of fears were overblown, and kind of based on seeing people as one homogenous block, which they never are. You know, there's always diversity in thought and opinion, always. You know. Now I know how Paul likes these things not to overrun too much, and we're an hour 15 on my counter. So, anything you want to finish up with?
Yeah, that's.
No, I guess that's it. If
Well,
we come to the end.
Have you enjoyed our conversation? There's a good question.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. Actually, I thought
open and free exchange of views. I mean, who would believe we could get away with it? Huh? So I enjoyed it.
You said at the beginning, obviously, that you'd taken a bit of a break from your shows. Any
probably
indication of when you might start putting some new ones up,
or whenever the next big documentary worth making news event happens. So I did when Trump lost the election. So something along that kind of scale of shock horror.
Don't forget to promote yourself, for God's sake. What's your YouTube channel? ChickenWire.
ChickenWire, yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, anything else you want to let people follow you at?
I tend to just stay on YouTube. I mean, I do have a Twitter, but I don't really tweet. It's ChickenWire as well.
For Twitter, I'm not very fond of it.
That is, hold on, let me pull it up. Wired Chicken, at Wired Chicken. Don't tell me why it's that. I think I forgot my username and I had to make a new one.
That happens, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well that will all go up on the page. It's been a pleasure for you coming back on the show, and I'm sure it won't be the last time. There's so much going on at the moment, anyway. I think with this Trump thing, I'm sure we haven't heard the last of this adventure. He's going to be up to something, especially now that's all that impeachment's done. It's going to be interesting.
It's going to be fun.
Where he goes from here.
I mean,
it's popcorn entertainment.
It's going to be an interesting year. Still, lots going on, and of course with Brexit, that's going to have a lot of things rolling off that, and of course COVID. I mean, there's signs of Boris talking about slowly letting this back to normal. We'll see how we go, but thanks again for coming on, and thank you, John. I'm sure we'll be doing something again soon, as we've been doing recently, and thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoyed the chat. Please message me if you've got any other ideas for
thank you very much.
You want to come on the show or anything else.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Thank you.